On June 1st, Ukraine launched a devastating drone attack against Russia, which has since dubbed Operation Spiderweb. Dozens of Russia's most valuable strategic bombers have been destroyed forever, with the most amazing thing being that Ukraine managed to carry out its strike from within Russia's territory. That would be devastating enough for Russian President Vladimir Putin. However, the worst thing about Operation Spiderweb, from Putin's perspective, is that Ukraine's drone strike just crushed Russia's spirit forever. And according to one military analyst who recently spoke to Times Radio, Russia may never recover from Operation Spiderweb. Now, before digging into that analyst's comment, it's worth starting with a brief recap of what Ukraine managed to achieve on June 1st. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Ukraine spent around 18 months planning Operation Spiderweb. Between January 2024 and June 2025, Ukraine managed to smuggle over 150 drones, 300 explosive payloads, and modular launch systems across the border and into Russia. Those drones were transported via covert logistical routes, while concealed inside wooden cabins that had concealed roof areas to hide Ukraine's weapons. Once Ukraine managed to get its trucks into Russia, it sent them to a series of warehouses located hundreds of miles apart. It had 4 targets: Olenia Air Base in Murmansk, Belaya Air Base in Irkutsk, Diaghilevo Air Base located in the Ryazan Oblast, and Ivanovo's self-titled air base. Ukraine chose these air bases for several reasons. In several cases, the bases were home to Russian Tu-160, Tu-95 and Tu-22 M3 strategic bombers, all of which Putin has used to launch hundreds of cruise missiles at Ukraine cities. Not only that, but these bombers are also capable of launching nuclear warheads, allowing Russia to accentuate its constant nuclear threats against Ukraine. The Diaghilevo is also where Russia sends its pilots for advanced strategic bomber training, along with being home to a repair and maintenance center for those aircraft. Ivanovo's airbase also housed an A-50 Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS aircraft, which helps Russia's bombers coordinate their attacks and evade Ukraine's air defenses. Ukraine couldn't hit those bases with long-range drones. According to CSIS, 2 of them were too far away for that approach. Belaya is in Siberia, an almost 2,485 miles away, making long-range strikes almost impossible. Olenia is a little closer, at 1,180 miles from Ukraine's border, though still nestled deeply enough into the Arctic that Putin never thought it would be a target. No wonder he used the bases to house some of his most valuable strategic bombers. This sheer distance is what led to Ukraine's unique truck-based approach. Once it had its trucks safely stored in warehouses close to these 4 air bases, Ukraine bided its time. When it was ready, its operators called Russian truck drivers to transport the trucks. Those Russians didn't know they were working with Ukraine. All they were told was to drive the trucks carrying the drones to specific locations in the vicinity of the 4 airfields Ukraine targeted. On June 1st, Ukraine gave the order. The special roofs built into the wooden crates loaded onto the back of their trucks opened and quadcopter drones poured out. In seconds, those drones were making their way to the 4 air bases, evading Russia's air defense systems thanks to their close range. Strike after strike against Russia's aircraft followed. By the end of the brilliant Ukrainian assault, Ukraine had destroyed around 40 of Russia's aircraft, decimating 34% of its strategic cruise missile delivery capability, while costing Putin about $7 billion in high-value equipment. It was a devastating day for Russia and a massive success for Ukraine. That leads to the analysis. On June 2nd, Times Radio sat down with Falklands War veteran and former senior British military advisor to US Central Command in Florida, Major General Chip Chapman. The first question posed to Chapman was simple. What was the significance of Ukraine's massive drone assault? Chapman points out that the attack was significant from an escalation standpoint.
In terms of escalation, we look at 7 metrics generally: weapons, objectives, targets, geography, domains, rhetoric or mobilization.
He points out that Ukraine's attack was significant on both the targets and the geography front. Nowhere was that clearer than with the Belaya airbase.
The most extensive one that they hit was over in Siberia at Belaya. which is 4,300 kilometers from Ukraine. That is way beyond the zone of action, as it were, of any of the Ukrainian cruise missiles.
Chapman isn't wrong. Ukraine's longest range cruise missile is likely the domestically produced Long Neptune, which itself is an offshoot of the Neptune missiles Ukraine has used so effectively in the Black Sea. According to DW, Long Neptune is believed to have an effective range of around 620 miles, nowhere near enough for it to reach at least 2 of the 4 targets Ukraine hit on June 1st. Long Neptune could have hit the Dygalevo and Ivanovo air bases, but even then, it might have not been the best option. The missiles provides a fairly large target for Russia's air defenses and doesn't offer the precision that the first-person view or FPV drones Ukraine ended up using can offer.
That's pretty significant in the way they've done it as an asymmetric attack, because an asymmetric attack using the capabilities of their existing long-range drones or missiles would not have done that.
The point Chapman is making here is simple. Putin believed that the air bases Ukraine just attacked were safe. Ukraine just proved him wrong, which is something that will likely force the Russian leadership to conduct a complete rethink of how it conducts its aerial strategy. That's something Russia doesn't want to do, but it's also something that Ukraine has forced it into in the past, as Chapman explains.
Of course, the Ukrainian A2AD, that's anti-air defense systems, have pushed the Russian aviation back.
In other words, the bombers that Ukraine just hit were already nestled so deeply in Russian territory that nobody, least of all Putin, believed that Ukraine could hit them. That approach allowed Russia to fire cruise missiles, generally Kh-101, says Chapman, from up to 2,800 kilometers away from the targets. It was a safe strategy for Putin. His bombers were located so far behind the Ukraine war's front lines that nobody could get to them. That was a move made out of necessity, as the early months of his invasion saw Ukraine destroy hundreds of Russian aircraft and bombers. As of June 3rd, Russia's aircraft losses inside Ukraine have reached 384, according to United 24 media. They're only that low because Putin pulled his aviation back. And in doing so, he opened up the door for rampaging missile attacks against Ukraine. CSIS highlights just how massive of a problem this has been for Ukraine. It says that between September 28, 2022 and September 1, 2024, Russia launched 11,466 missiles at Ukraine, achieving an average of 23.2 missiles per day. Therein lies the significant issue Chapman is talking about. Putin was only able to achieve this massive volume of launches because he positioned his bombers where he thought Ukraine wouldn't be able to reach them. Now, with a third of those bombers destroyed, Ukraine may have relieved the missile-based pressure Russia was placing on them to the tune of several thousand missiles per year. That's massive. It also has ramifications for the battle happening inside Ukraine. Fewer missile strikes mean Putin has to rely more heavily on his soldiers on the ground to take Ukrainian territory. They're already doing a bad job of that. In April 2025, the new Voice of Ukraine said that Russia only managed to capture around 67.5 square miles of Ukraine. That's progress at a snail's pace, and it's not going to get any faster now that Putin's ground forces can no longer rely on hordes of missiles to do much of the damage to Ukraine's defenses. Chapman also brings up the subterfuge Ukraine pulled off during its drone raid. As mentioned earlier, a large part of Ukraine's plan revolved around using unsuspecting Russian truck drivers to get its drones into position. That's another major problem for Putin. Chapman points out that Ukraine used 117 separate drones in the attack and speculates that each of those drones may have needed its own operator. But it's the subterfuge that was the most impressive aspect of the strike, he tells Times Radio.
They also managed to use subterfuge to get people to drive those trucks to the location. So there's a kind of rather like a sort of supply chain. There's a supply chain of cunningness all the way from the Ukrainian border to how they did this. So you can say that this was a tremendously well planned and executed operation, even if it doesn't have the totality of success that they might first have alluded to.
It's a level of success that will also force Putin to ask questions. Questions like, were any Russians involved in Ukraine's drone attack? And how did my operatives fail to prevent a Ukrainian strike that was 18 months in the making? Bear in mind that paranoia is far from a new feeling for Putin. This is a man who has already undertaken several culls of his generals since he launched his Ukraine invasion, including one that saw him axe 6 generals in August 2022, and another that led him to sacking his former defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, in May 2024. Putin is also likely responsible for the deaths of several prominent Russians he believes hindered his invasion, including former Wagner mercenary group head Yevgeny Prigozhin. The point here is that Putin is a man who does not take failure lightly. Questions will be asked about how Ukraine was allowed to pull off Operation Spiderweb, and it'll be almost impossible for anybody to deliver a satisfactory answer to Putin. Given the Russian leader's past exploits, the odds are high that heads are going to roll over the next few days and months. And with each loss of an official or general Putin once trusted, Russia's military machine is weakened. Still, Putin can at least soothe himself with one thought. It's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to do something like Operation Spiderweb again. At least that's Chapman's opinion.
Can't repeat that method again. That's the only problem you have when you do something with this sort of ingenuity.
Chapman likens what Ukraine pulled off to a mass breakout at a prison. It might be able to be pulled off once, but afterward, the prison guards will be on the lookout for people trying to emulate the approach taken in the past. But even that gives us another hint at how Ukraine has crushed Russia's spirit with Operation Spiderweb. The once proud Russian intelligence operation has had the wool pulled over its collective eyes. A nation that prides itself on subterfuge has just become the victim of one of the most cunning strikes seen in modern warfare, and it didn't see any of it coming. Add the loss of cruise missile capacity, the havoc this will wreak in the upper echelons of Russian command, and the fact that Ukraine hit targets Putin thought were safe, and the result is a combination of factors that have sapped Russian confidence and morale. And that's all before getting into the other major problem Operation Spiderweb created for Russia. Ukraine just took out a huge chunk of one of the arms of Russia's nuclear triad. The Arms Control Center explains that this triad offers Russia the capability to launch its 5,977 nuclear warheads, of which it says 1,588 are actively deployed from land, sea or air. The majority of that triad is land-based, with Russia having 306 strategic intercontinental ballistic missiles loaded with 1,185 nuclear missiles between them. Beyond that, Russia has 11 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines that can carry 16 missiles capable of collectively delivering 624 nuclear warheads. Then there's the aerial arm, the one that Ukraine targeted and just mostly decimated. That arm consists of 68 heavy bombers, broken up between the two 160s that Ukraine destroyed during Operation Spiderweb and two 85 MS aircraft. Combined, those aircraft account for 700 nuclear warheads, and Ukraine believes it took out about a third of the fleet. Russia's aerial nuclear capabilities haven't been broken, however, they've been severely diminished to the point where Ukraine likely has less to worry about when it comes to Putin's repeated nuclear threats. Chapman tells Times Radio that Ukraine has achieved even more than many might realise.
If you've destroyed 43% of the inventory, it is absolutely not the case that you will have 100% of the inventory which is available for operations at any one time.
Quibbles about percentages aside, the point Chapman is making is that though Ukraine destroyed a third of Russia's bomber fleet, that third actually amounts to much more, given that not all of Russia's bombers are actively deployed or even capable of being deployed. Chapman goes on to explain to Times Radio that the cannibalization of aircraft in that fleet has likely been occurring, with Russia relying on spare parts from its other bombers to repair those that it currently has active. He also notes that there are issues related to the flying rates of these bombers.
The flying rate of the aircraft has probably been caveated in the last few years by the sanctions regime and the ability to get sort of spares and things like that.
Now, this is an important point, and it's another reason why Russia will struggle to recover from Operation Spiderweb. Ukraine picked its targets very carefully. On the surface level, it's taken out around 40 bombers responsible for launching cruise missiles while carrying the threat of nuclear war. That's a big enough win in itself, but it also knows how much sanctions are weighing down on Russia. Right now, Castellum AI says that Russia is laboring under 24,311 sanctions from the US, European Union, and many other Ukrainian allies, with 21,692 of those sanctions having been implemented since Putin launched his invasion. Those sanctions make it much harder for Russia to trade, which has the end result of it not receiving the volume of parts it needs for things like keeping its bomber fleet in the skies. That led to the cannibalization of existing aircraft, as Chapman explains, which had already reduced the strength of Russia's bomber fleet before Operation Spiderweb. Now, Russia has to deal with dozens of its planes being hit, many of which would have already been difficult to repair, but may not ever see the skies again. And that's not all. Chapman points out that it's not just repairs that are going to be a massive issue for Russia. The odds are that it's not going to be able to build new bombers to replace those it's lost for many years.
None of these aircraft are in production anymore.
He's right. Practically all of that aircraft Ukraine just destroyed are relics of the Soviet era that Russia no longer builds. For instance, the Tu-160 took its maiden flight in December 1981. It's undergone several rounds of modernization since, including one that began in 2021 and is supposedly still running. But new Tu-160s aren't being built, and given the cannibalization issues and the loss of so many of these aircraft due to Operation Spiderweb, it's probably safe to assume that the modernization program has ground to a standstill. Of the bombers Ukraine just destroyed, Chapman tells Times Radio,
these aircraft. So to replace them when you haven't got a production line would be incredibly expensive.
Putin simply doesn't have the money needed to build new bombers. On May 12, Business Insider ran a report claiming that Russia is on pace to run out of its financial reserves by the fall of 2025. Euromaidan Press says that it's estimated that the Ukraine war is costing Russia almost $1 billion per day. These aren't small issues for Putin. He's already dealing with an attritional war that's drained Russia's bank account. There's no money to spare for building new bombers, and likely won't be for many years after the Ukraine war ends. That wasn't a small victory for Ukraine. It was a massive shot that may have changed the face of Russia's military, at least on the aerial bomber front, forever, observes Chapman to Times Radio.
I think these aircraft go into the irreplaceable sort of bucket, really. So to regenerate that capability would take a huge number of years, and certainly under a sanctions regime, and the fact that the Russians have sort of reached the zenith, really, of their productive capability in economic terms. I think anything that's written off.
Yes, written off. Putin can't just wave a magic wand and put new bombers into production. He doesn't have the money, the facilities, or the capability to build up either, while Russia is laboring under sanctions. Russia's bombers are just gone, likely never to be rebuilt. Symbolically, this is a massive humiliation for Putin. So long positioned as a strongman of Russian politics, he now has to try to explain to the Russian people why he, as their protector, just allowed Ukraine to decimate a huge portion of Russia's aerial offensive capability. He'll try to characterize Operation Spiderweb as a terrorist attack. In fact, he's already doing just that. In the wake of the operation, Russia's Ministry of Defense released a statement decrying Ukraine's massive victory as a terrorist act. It's also trying to minimize the damage, with the BBC reporting that Russia claims to have repelled the drones launched in the Ivanovo, Ryazan and Amur regions. All it will say about the damage is that several aircraft caught fire, not even admitting that the reason this happened was due to Ukraine's explosive FPV drones.
It is a failure of Russian force protection. I'm sure someone or some people will be hanging by out of the windows in the next few days if that's the way that Putin's anger manifests itself.
Chapman also suggests to Times Radio that there may be another Russian missile strike against Ukraine in the next few days as Putin tries to prove that he can still hit Ukraine hard. But all of that will be chest beating by a Russian president who, as Chapman says, has just been forced to write off some of the most important assets in his aerial arsenal. Now, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other video where we cover exactly how Ukraine pulled off Operation Spiderweb. We dig deep into the in-depth planning, subterfuge, and impact of Ukraine's strike in that video. Also, be sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the latest Ukrainian successes against Putin's expansionist regime, as well as other military conflicts around the globe.